Good afternoon, everyone. I can't see everybody because we have stuff on the screen, but I want to welcome you to today's event, which is a conversation with Dr. Beeta Baghoolizadeh about her new book, The Color Black: Enslavement and Erasure in Iran. And I'm very happy that you all can join us for this really important event. And before I get started and introduce Dr. Baghoolizadeh, I wanted to mention that this week on Thursday, if you're interested, we are having an online tea, what we call our community, from 2 to 3, and you can find the link in the bio if you want to register. And also, I wanted to announce that on October 30th, we have another talk coming up with Dr. Firuzeh Kashani-Sabet about her new book called From Heroes to Hostages, the U.S. and Iran from 1830 to 1992, I think. I can't remember the exact dates. And you can also register for that with the link in our bio. Today, we're really honored to be hosting Beeta Baghoolizadeh. I think you'll find her talk a fascinating introduction to the history of slavery in Iran, as well as the ways that people of African descent, Black people, have been made erased by some of the politics and histories inside of Iran over the last 100 years. And one of the things that I asked her to talk a little bit about is not just the research that is undergirding this book, but also some of the implications for this research. Dr. Baghoolizadeh is the Associate Research Scholar at Princeton University's Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. And her book, The Color Black: Enslavement and Erasure in Iran, was published by Duke University Press in March of this year. It examines questions concerning race, gender, historiography, and visuality, and has won the Scholars of Color First Book Award at Duke University Press. Beeta's scholarship is featured in American Historical Review, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and Lateral Journal of the Cultural Studies Association. Before joining Princeton, Beeta was an assistant professor of history and critical Black studies at Bucknell University, and her research has been supported by a variety of resources, including the Social Science Research Council, and she was a research fellow at Bard Graduate Center. I'm going to let her have the floor, and we will have her talk for somewhere between 25 and 35 minutes. I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll ask you to put your questions in the chat. And if there's a lot of them, I might summarize them, but we can also move to a direct hands up at the end. So without further ado, welcome, Beeta Baghoolizadeh, and thank you for spending your afternoon with us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I want to thank Persis for inviting me here today, to Nick for all the logistics. It's really so special to join you here at the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies. And I just want to acknowledge all of the important work that the center has done over the years, just that it's really an unparalleled place, both in its focus and its work. So I'm grateful for the chance to be here with you tonight. So my book just came out, The Color Black: Enslavement and Erasure in Iran. And I work on constructions of race through the lens of slavery and abolition throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. And so today I want to talk to you about this history, how it's been erased, and some of the paradoxes that it poses for us. So in 1977, the introduction to the Art of Black Africa exhibit was held in Tehran. It was sponsored by the Queen of Iran, Farah Dibo's Foundation, Farabi University, National Iranian Radio and Television, and it featured pieces on loan from museums representing 14 countries in West or Central Africa. The exhibition included wooden masks, like the one you see in the poster, but also statues, ornamental objects, even hair combs, staff, swords, and other wood-carved objects. For 6 weeks, from November 1st through December 16th, 1977, people could visit mornings and afternoons to see them at Bogh-Ferdows. The exhibition was a big deal. Fardiba herself described it at the opening event. چنین نمایشگاهی برای نخستین بار در خارج از افریقا برگزار می‌شود. That the exhibition was the first of its kind outside of Africa. The honorary committee had both Iranian and African officials and ambassadors. The catalogs were printed in multiple languages, one specifically printed in English and French, so you know that they had envisioned this, international audience. And in the catalog, they really stressed the importance of this exhibition for being the first time Iran and Africa had met at a crossroads, how a bridge had been built to share these cultures. It also talked about the history of slavery and colonialism in Africa, but mostly it focused on the Atlantic slave trade, how so many people had been enslaved in the Americas. There was only one sentence, and I've highlighted it here for you. There's only one sentence that referred to slavery in the Middle East, and specifically not Iran, that Zanzibar and other places, quote, exported slaves to Arabia. This is honestly a fascinating assertion, because not only was there a history of enslavement in Iran, which we'll talk about, there was a history of enslaving East Africans in Iran. And the entire exhibit, this entire art exhibit, was held in a former palace where enslaved people had once served the royal family. And so this is just one way of how Iranians were rewriting and replacing these histories. So these are the kinds of histories that are circulating in Iran and the diasporas. But what is the history that we want to tell? So as a social and cultural historian, I'm interested in questions of race, gender, historiography, and visuality. And I have both an intellectual and an ethical commitment to writing histories that honor those who were subjected to forms of oppression and their stories silenced from history. And in the color Black, I make 3 major interventions. First, I argue that enslavement was a process of forced visibility, and that abolition was a process of forced invisibility. I argue that Iranians had a clear understanding of race and racialization, and they used that to frame and justify the enslavement. And that that Iranians, like others, wielded this racial difference to frame slavery and society at large. And third, I argue that both the processes of enslavement and abolition force a restructuring of society completely. So urban layouts, notions of gender and sexuality, the family, all of these had to be dealt with again after abolition to deal with the vacuum of not just enslaved people, but the possibility of enslaving people. And so essentially my arguments boil down to, you cannot write a history of modern Iran without the history of enslavement and abolition. But historiographically, this is exactly how the history of modern Iran has been written. For example, there's only one monograph on the history of enslavement in modern Iran in English. Was published in 2018, and in it the author completely rejects the idea that race might have even been somewhat relevant. And she cites a historian of the Ottoman Empire to demonstrate that race is not important across the Middle East and categorically different from the Americas. I will just note, I also disagree with this idea that it wasn't relevant in the Ottoman Empire. We can leave that for the Q&A. But even if we move away from books specifically on slavery, even in political histories of Iran, so for example, in books about the 19th century Qajar court or the Constitutional Revolution in 1906, these are very common trajectories in Iranian historiography. The role of the enslaved person is not present as an analytic. They are at best mentioned in passing or in a footnote, and it really begs the question, how are people so fundamentally part of Iranian society not written into these major histories? Maybe I can offer you two reasons why this history is so ignored. That first, these are some of the stories that nationalists tell themselves. And second, maybe domestic forms of enslavement or the domestic economy are not taken seriously, that they're considered benevolent or not really slavery. But I came to these conclusions after doing archival work over the course of several years in Iran, as well as in the UK and Switzerland. And as I worked through my research, I was struck by how much of enslavement and race was really intended to be seen and felt during this period. So in addition to the textual archival documents I found, I also incorporated visual sources as well as spatial sources to trace how they both accommodated and erased the enslaved. So let me just pause here and give some background on the history of enslavement in Iran. Elite and wealthy Iranians had for centuries enslaved people from around Iran, the Caucasus, Central Asia, South Asia, and East Africa, in domestic spaces as nannies, wet nurses, eunuchs, cooks, and other critical forms of labor for managing the everyday life of the enslaving family. They were, for the large part, symbols of power and status. There are also examples of chattel slavery in the South, but my book is really focused on these enslaved peoples in these domestic roles in these urban spaces, not only in the South, but also in other major cities throughout Iran, because their presence and their gradual disappearance shaped much of the discourse of race and racism on a national scale. So what's strange is that in the Iranian case, even though all of these different types of people were recognized as categorically enslavable, by the late 19th century, because of a series of geopolitical shifts that I can talk about in the Q&A, a particular language of slavery arises that racialized East Africans as exclusively Black and Black as equivalent to slave. And that in turn shaped a specific type of anti-Blackness, a racism that is virulent, but after abolition in Iran would be actively denied and erased while still persisting. So the first move towards the abolition of the slave trade was in 1848. It was a decree banning the trafficking of enslaved people in the Persian Gulf ports. And then about 70 years later, the Iranian parliament passed a law freeing all enslaved people in 1929, bringing the end of legal enslavement in Iran. So you have this 70-year period. And this 70-year period, I argue, was a period of forced visibility that framed legal enslavement in Iran, where Iranians who were able to enslave someone in their home enslaved East Africans, they enslaved Black people. And by doing so, they were also signaling that they wanted to be seen as enslavers, that they wanted the people that they enslaved to be seen as well. So after abolition in 1929, Iranians restructured their society to accommodate a life without the expectation of enslaved labor. And in the process, they rewrote their histories to erase slavery completely. But my research also looks at the legacies of this history. So I look beyond that 1929 date to pretty much almost the present day. And so you can see how the first half of the book looks at that final period of legal enslavement in Iran, and the second half of the book looks at erasure and the afterlives of these erasures. I do want to share, though, that this isn't how my research started. When I first started working on this project over 12 years ago, I did so because I knew that there were instances of enslavement within Iran, but whenever I asked anyone, be it regular Iranians or scholars or archivists, their response was always very much, "Oh, we didn't have slaves. Iranians didn't have slaves. We are not racist. You must be talking about the U.S. You are so American." But there was a history of enslavement, and I had wanted to figure out exactly what that history was, to the point where the original working title of my project was From Slave to Citizen. I was really interested in this very real transition from being enslaved to gaining legal status as an equal member of society after 1929. But as Christina Sharp has written, those of us who teach, write, and think about slavery and its afterlives encounter myriad silences and ruptures in time, space, history, ethics, and research as we do our work. And as I researched, I came up against more examples of those silences, of those ruptures, and that's what pushed me to conceive of the book as one of two halves: first, enslavement, and second, erasure. And in the book, the term Black is a critical one, and that's because during the 19th century, the term Black was a critical one. And I'm translating it literally from Persian, the term siyah. So the usage of Black as an adjective to describe people is pretty old in Persian. We have centuries worth of literary examples of siyah being used, such as Zangi siyah, the Black Zanzibari, Hindu siyah, the Black Indian, regardless of their free or enslaved status. But in the mid-19th century, and the earliest example I found of this was in 1850, you suddenly have the ability to say the siyah, the Black, and it refers to an individual. The use of the adjective also continued, but the entrance of this noun was new. It indicated something new in the understanding of how a term like this could be used. And in this case, it could be used something who is African, visibly Black, and also enslaved. This didn't happen in the Persian language before the mid-19th century, and it is directly linked to both patterns of enslavement and abolition, because before, enslavement was varied and not hyper-focused on Black people in Iran. Early in the 19th century, terms and labels for the enslaved were much more geographically or ethnically oriented, regardless of where the individual was from, whether they were Caucasian or African. So, for example, we have this variety of terms like Habashi, Abyssinian, Somali from Somalia, and they were used alongside other terms like Gorgi, Georgian, Cherkessi, Circassian, Gorgi, sorry. Although white and Black had both been used as adjectives, white never took on this meaning as a noun in this context. That doesn't happen until, I mean, Sefid as a noun does not really happen until my generation. Is, of Iranian Americans is dealing with white people in the US context. Instead, only ethnic and geographic terms from different parts of Africa fell out of favor, and they were all subsumed in the favor of the color Black of siyah. And so we can see a direct example of this in Tehran's census records in 1867. They have all these different categories. You can see some of them here: homeowners versus renters, Qajar versus Tehrani, Esfani, Azerbaijani, other men, women, children, servants, but only one category is marked by race. And here it's used as an adjective, but still enslaved Black women and enslaved Black men, Ghulam siyah and Kaniz siyah. With the other categories, the non-Blackness was assumed. Only the enslaved were marked by Blackness. And once all the numbers were tallied, the enslaved Black people made up 2.5% of Tehran's entire population. And I want to show a document where this Blackness was instructive of the enslavement of a person. So in 1837, in a handwritten contract only 8 lines long, Yaqut Ghulam, or Rui the slave, lost parental rights to any future children. Instead, he signed the rights to his unborn children off to Muhammad Baghoolizadeh in exchange for marriage to an enslaved woman. Enslavers often claimed rights to the children of the men they enslaved, since enslaved status was inherited from one's father. This was a patrilineal society, so this was not unusual. But this contract was different. Yaqut Ghulam was free. His name and title were a reminder of a former enslaved life, but he was now free. So his children should have been, would have been, should have been free. But instead, 6 people approved of the contract and stamped the agreement, even though this is an agreement that is illegal by Islamic law. We can see their stamps all around the document here. His newly married wife is not even given a name here. Instead, Yaqut Ghulam is identified as siyah fam, or black-colored, and his wife as a beautiful, sweet, kind, black-faced Abyssinian woman. These adjectives cushion the otherwise cruel destiny that Selmi had arranged for her, one without any power in the creation of her own family. We might in our haste think that this is a marriage contract, since it's putting the terms of marriage of 2 individuals in written form, but I would argue that this is not a marriage contract. Marriage contracts followed a specific template. They began in the name of God, followed by religious verses and blessings for the bride and groom, and they ended with the mention of a dower, a series of tangible gifts promised from the groom to the bride. Marriage contracts were intended to reflect some beauty. Either they would have some sort of small floral motif decorating the corners, or, opulent documents decorated with gold. But this unnamed woman and Yaqut Ghulam were promised to each other in a few lines that gifted them nothing and stole their children. There is nothing beautiful or decorative about it. That document with Yaqut Ghulam and his unnamed wife was held at the National Archives in Iran. And this is another document originally from the National Archives as well. And I just want to talk to you a little bit about my research process. I found throughout my research that these documents are not held in a straightforward way. Instead, some of these erasures run so deep that they pervaded even archival institutions. So I said earlier, this is a document that's held at the branch of the National Archives in Iran. So as the Kitabkhane Milli, you can see its logo in the corner here. Let's see, right here. And you can see at the center of this image, there's a historical document from the late 19th century, and that it has this like faux floral and calligraphic border that was added clearly recently. And at the bottom in Persian, it says example of a wedding contract. But this is not a wedding contract. It's been digitized at Harvard's Women's World and Qajar Iran Digital Archive as a sale document, but it's really not quite a sale document either. This is actually a text summarizing the conflict and resolution about a sale that happened in the past. So it's not a contract, it's sort of a legal testimony to resolving the issue. So the seller claimed that they hadn't received proper compensation for the sale of a Black man named Salman, but they ultimately came to a compromise and received more money for the sale. And so whoever created this border at the National Archives, and it's at the Yazd branch of the National Archives, they really were not paying attention when they were reading the document, because they've labeled it as an example of a wedding contract. And I think the reason why they did this is that in the last line of the document, like all the way at the bottom over here, there's this phrase that says "Sireh masaleh," which we can roughly translate as a vow of reconciliation. And so those of you who are familiar with Persian, you know that the word sireh is often used to refer to marriage vows. But here it's used more expansively, right? So whoever made the border zeroed in on that word, said, great, this is a wedding contract, like let's just move on. Made some really interesting stylistic choices here, probably for display of some sort, uh, which is really revelatory. Like they didn't even read the document clearly. And it's not just a one-off mistake, it's just reflective of the attitudes around enslavement and Iran's history of enslavement. I do want to end with a photo, and I want to note that I took the inclusion of photographs in my work very seriously. And after doing a lot of research, and I mentioned this earlier, on spatial and textual and visual sources, it became very clear to me that visual sources were extensions of the enslavement, right? I wanted to tread carefully with them for that reason. But the history of enslavement is so erased and so denied and so commonly rejected that I did ultimately choose to include them in my work to correct the context that they are shared in. And so it's for that reason that I do include photography in my work. That these photographs and others like them are often referenced in claims that slavery in Iran was not bad, or was not slavery at all, or that the enslaved were part of the family. So it's been really important for me to address these photographs and to correct that context. But this particular photograph and the way that it's circulated has really stayed with me. So this is another photograph that's been published both in Iran and in the US. So in Iran, in a volume published by the Parliamentary Archives and Library of Iran, the volume is on women's issues during the Constitutional Revolution, and then digitized in Harvard's Women's World and Raja Iran archive. This is clearly an elite enslaving family. Not many families were able to take these sort of stage photographs during the late 19th or early 20th century. And I can talk about it and other photos in the Q&A. But you can see how the entire photograph is posed. They're standing outside. They've hauled this gilded frame, oil painting outside. They've brought out chairs for the matriarch of the family, and everyone else is sort of huddled around her. But for now, I want to focus on this little girl to the left. You can see she's wearing a dotted chador. Her bangs are perfectly curled. In the Parliamentary Archive volume, she's identified as Juju. Juju is a sweet term of endearment. It's a childish way of saying Juje or little chick. But in the digital archive out, however, she is labeled with a much more vulgar name. She's described as Suski, which is a diminutive of the word susk or cockroach. How did these two different archives get such different names, such different connotations? Neither of these terms are names at all. When I was in Tehran and doing fieldwork at the Parliamentary Archives, I asked one of the editors of the volume why this little girl is labeled as Juju. Juju is not a name. He shrugged and said, better than having no name at all. And the question arises, better for who? Who are these records for? And who is this history for? These are the questions I want to leave you all with today. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions and comments. I'll just stop sharing.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Beeta, for that lovely introduction to your book. And I want to encourage people to actually read this book. I'm so impressed both by the volume of material you found in the archives, but also your ability to, painstakingly interpret them. And I think part of what is impressive in some ways is that you're pioneering a different look at the history of slavery, but also fundamentally going against the grain. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about either what that was like for you to encounter this material and ask these questions and have people meet your questions either with forms of dismissiveness or denial, and how is it being received now in the context of your book?
Yeah, thank you, Persis. That's a very a, a really important question. And I want to thank you for drawing attention to the fact of the volume of material I found. And I really did find a lot, which was shocking to me because I I really expected at some point, and I think I was told that I wouldn't find much, right? Um, that this was an uncommon history. It was rare. It was not really, it didn't really happen. And I mean, Black people were amongst the first to be photographed in Iran. And that's because they were so close to the positions of power. They were in the Qajar court. And, you know, Nasser-Din Shah at the time was a prince when he first was gifted 2 cameras in 1841. And then he becomes Shah in 1848. And throughout his reign as the ruler of Iran, set up this photography studio and is taking so many photographs, and the enslaved people of his court are very prominent in these photographs. So I have so many memories of being in the archives and the archivists really dealing with my research differently. I mean, some of them were very generous, but some of them would straight up say, "Oh, slavery, you can't study that. You know, Cyrus the Great freed all the slaves." Meanwhile, they're the gatekeeper to all these documents that I managed um, to get access to. And I think the range of responses to my work has been pretty extreme. I think I've been supported by people like yourself and others who recognize that, you know, I mean, we're academics, but also serving the Iranian diaspora community, recognizing that we would like to forge forward with, you know, an inclusive anti-racist community, that this is something that needs to be talked about and addressed so that we can, you know, build a better future, to people being really aggressive and hostile towards me for airing out the dirty laundry. Um, um, I think now that the book is out, I think there are people who are taking some time to read it, you know. And I think it was really important for me to make the book be readable. You know, it is at the end of the day an academic book, but I didn't want to make it heavy with jargon or anything like that. I really wanted it to be accessible, and I wanted it to honor these histories. So
Yeah, thank you for that. Also for it's a wonderful book to read, right? It's not over jargony and it's engaging. So I want to compliment you on that also. I'm gonna ask one more question, and I see some people have put some questions in the chat. I was wondering if maybe for people's understanding who haven't seen the book, if you could show a couple of those pictures actually that you referred
oh,
to.
sure.
Because I do think that reading the visual image is part of what you do so well in the book.
Mhm.
To talk a little bit about relations of power, the way the gaze is situated, and what some of the hidden meanings could actually be that are not often, you know, taken into consideration.
Yeah. Sure, sorry, we had so much trouble doing this earlier. Let me see if I can share my screen without it being difficult without it being too without it driving me crazy, I guess is the issue. So let me see if I can do this. Do you see the image or do
Yeah.
you see my notes? Okay, great. So yeah, so photography is, like I said, a really exceptional piece of technology in the 19th century because it makes its way to Iran. That's because a lot of the larger major inventions never make it to Iran, like the train. We don't have a train in Iran until the 20th century, but the camera was light, it was movable. And so it came very quickly and people really took to it. And so this is, let's see, a photograph from the Golestan Palace. Nasruddin Shah himself probably took this photograph, and we can see in the middle here. Sorry, can you see my mouse here?
Yes. Yes.
This is a little prince. His name was Hassan Khan. Everyone else in this photograph was enslaved and photographed for his sake. This photograph is one in a series, and in this photograph, this enslaved Black woman here, she's labeled as Goli Chehre here. But in other photographs that included some of the Shah's wives, she's specified as Siyah Goli Chehre, the Black Goli Chehre, to distinguish her from other women. And so in the Golestan archives, these photographs are held there and filed under the women's albums, Album Zanon. And even though these photographs often included more than just simply women, and like I said, this one in particular was taken for Hassan Khan, they're all sort of like, oh, that's like a woman's thing, and sort of thrown in these albums, but they're also all reinscribing race with status, Blackness with enslavement. And so woman becomes a catch-all for anything domestic. And so by the time it became available to wealthy families to hire photographers, the norms of this photography had become more standardized. So as a result, we have many photographs of similar poses. So the enslaving family typically was seated. You see them seated here, even though they're just children. And the individuals standing often to the side or even the margins of the photograph were enslaved. Of course, there are examples where the members of the enslaving family might have been standing, depending on age, gender, or rank within the family. So like a grandmother would never be standing, but a grandchild might be. Those are just typically exceptions, and this is like the main scaffolding pattern that we would have seen that used the Blackness of enslaved individuals within the home to distinguish them from members of the family. And so we can see one major change from the photographs in the Shah's court to these commercial family shoots, where in the Qajar court, there were so many enslaved people and one royal. This is flipped, right? You have one enslaved person and then several members of the enslaving family. And this makes sense both in the context of the royal court. The royal court really was just the center of so many enslaved people, of where so many people were enslaved. But also by the time that photography becomes available as a commercial good, it's just much harder to enslave people logistically because of the ongoing efforts to abolish the slave trade. And that's sort of reflected in these photographs. And so these two photographs are two portraits from two different families, but clearly structured along the same sort of language of photography and language of enslavement, when this is now a common language. And so both photos, the enslaved man is presented as a chaperone for the children of the family to show that they are well taken care of. But in this photograph, and I'll just talk about this photograph. The man standing his name is Abul Qasim, he's identified as a Khanezad. And for those of you who know Persian, Khanezad, born of the house that enslaves them, born of the house with the enslaved part, sort of tacit. Essentially an enslaved individual who was born to parents who were enslaved in the same home. And on the back of this photograph, it had this small message. It said, Abul Qasim, Saifuddin, Badi Zaman, Ali Naghi, these were the names of the children, dedicating the children's photo to you so that you can visit us in Tehran. And then it says, Ali Saifuddin, and Saifuddin is this child, ولی سیفالدین خودش از عکسش بهتره، خیلی صورتش سیاه شده، سایه افتاده است. That Saifuddin is much better than his photo. His face looks very black because of a shadow. But what about Abul Qasim? Abul Qasim is black. Abul Qasim is standing right there. But Abul Qasim's blackness does not need to be mentioned in this caption because his was understood. He was standing, he was shepherding, he was clearly their escort, not a member of the family. Only the dark complexion of this child was noteworthy, and only to correct it, to identify him as enslaver and not enslaved. And so these photographs are also teaching people how to read race and how to read blackness in a black and white or in a sepia photograph. And so some people have argued that like these photographs were just taken for the family, they had no value outside of the family, but this one we see is one that was mailed, right? So sent from Tehran to another city, and is clearly circulating. So I can talk a lot more about photographs. I have like, several more I could show you, but I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. That was really helpful for you to do that. Thank you. So of course, someone's asking a question. Darius Fatimi is asking about the character of Haji Firuz based on the Black presence in Iran. And I know you have both done some work on that and also have opinions about it. So I wonder if you could briefly give your take on the presence of Haji Firuz in the Iranian folkloric tradition and where it emerges from and what the critiques that you might level against it are.
Yeah, every time I do a talk, and there are Iranian members in the audience, is absolutely the first question I receive, and others working on similar topics receive, and that's because of how limited many members of Iranian communities are like in contact with Black Iranians, or just how heavily erased this history has been, right? So yeah, there are a lot of different sort of myths that will explain the history of Haji Firuz as, it's related to the Shahnameh, it's related to Zoroastrian life before Islam, it's related to this, that, whatever. Haji Firuz was the common name of a eunuch in the Qajar court. During the 19th century, it became very common to make fun of the eunuchs as part of popular slapstick comedy that was done at the court, and the eunuchs were a particularly good target for these comedians because there are really no repercussions for making fun of them, right? Eunuchs they occupied this space where they had a lot of power in the court, but at the end of the day, they were enslaved. And so they made for an easy target. The character Haji Firuz really becomes popular after abolition. It's very, very hard to find references to Haji Firuz as the Nowruz character, not the eunuch, but as the Nowruz character predating the 1940s. It really takes off in the 1950s, and it's presented as timeless, even though it comes out of a direct process of comedians going into the Qajar court, like siyah-bazi comedians, people who do blackface theater, going into the Qajar court, copying things that the eunuchs would say. The eunuchs often spoke in Pidgin Persian. So even things where Haji Firuz says Somboli alaikum instead of Salam alaikum, the way that the word twists in their mouth, but also Somboli alaikum as a phallic sexual reference, right? The sombol, the hyacinth, being a sexual image when eunuchs were castrated and desexualized, was a layer of the comedy that has really become sanitized. And that's why this is such a common question. But I talk about it at length in chapter 5 of my book. I also have an article online. If you Google it, it's a pretty concise like history of Haji Firuz. But yeah, Haji Firuz is directly linked to this history. And this is what I'm talking about when I say it's a history that's been erased, but it still persists in its racism, right? That we're looking at a Black figure and who's saying, you know, my master, hold your head up high, my master, like, laugh, it's a fun day, you know, that's replaying enslavement. And for those of us who grew up with Haji Firuz, we were taught that this is something that's supposed to make us happy and feel good. But if we just take a step back, it's very clear what's going on. So I would really like for Haji Firuz to be completely removed from Nora's traditions, even removing just the blackface. I know that's a common thing that people are doing. I don't think it's enough because the character as a whole in its entirety is a minstrel character mocking enslaved Black people. So that's my take.
Thank you. There's two questions, and I'm going to sort of combine them in the interest of time. One is, you know, what has happened to the descendants of these enslaved people inside of Iran? And the second question is, Niaz is asking a little bit about the community of descendants of enslaved people. Do they have their own unique communities? Or are they blended into the larger community at this point? And of course, I would suspect it's different depending on geography, but maybe you could talk a little bit about some of those questions.
Yeah, a number of different things, a number of different trajectories. I don't want to say we're open to, but there were a number of different trajectories that took place. Let me just say that. The abolition law was really a rush bill. Reza Shah was, you know, we remember Reza Shah in like a history book for modernizing Iran, for changing how people wear clothing, for institutionalizing the name laws and stuff like that. The abolition of slavery is really the first thing he did. And I think that really reflects how it was embarrassing for Iran to have slavery on the books at this point. And so the law was printed in newspapers the day after it was passed. And there weren't that many options for people. Some people, you know, if they had an enslaved woman working in their home, they would free her under the guise of marrying her as a second wife to either the patriarch of the family or a relative. There were families in like other urban centers. So like in Kerman, for example, the enslaving family had enslaved a family of Black people. And so they resettled them in a village outside of Kerman proper, and maintained some relationships with them. And there are other families where the formerly enslaved people never left and just sort of took on the role of a slave, of a servant. And we can think about how complicated or problematic that is. And then in the South, where there were sort of other economic opportunities, and there were communities of free Black people, they were sort of incorporated into the city differently. So they would have joined as like dock workers or laborers in that way. But if people were enslaved in, for example, Esfahan, at the Qajar court in Esfahan, their descendants did move around. Some of them were in Esfahan, some of them might have moved to the south. But yeah, and there are Black Iranians in not just the south, but in these major urban centers today as well. Let me just scroll down to reread. Niaz is, what is the community of Black enslaved? So the other thing that's important is that the history of erasure that happens, it's also a quiet erasure that the Black Iranians also participated in because of the stigma of enslavement. And so it's only very recently where you'll meet people and they'll say, oh, I am the descendant of someone who was enslaved. But there's a documentary by Behnaz Mirzai, and in it, she talks about how within these different like local groups and communities in the South, there's a sense of who has enslaved ancestry and who had free ancestry. And so they, even though it's quiet, they've maintained some sort of stratification there as well. In some places they have their own unique communities, but I mean, when I was in Bushehr and Bandar Abbas for my field work, it was clear that they've blended into the larger community. And those who are in Esfahan and Tehran or other urban centers have also blended in. Just there's really not that many of them for them to be completely closed off. It just wouldn't be a sustainable community in that way.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read this question. Are there any documents showing Iranians who were against slavery, anyone inside the country who was fighting for abolition? And my impression is that the end of slavery was really an exercise by outsiders pressuring Reza Shah to sign that. So was there any internal conversation about the ethics of enslaving people?
There were a few different conversations about the ethics of enslaving people, and they took a few different routes. Among Sufis, there were Sufi tariqats that really believed in the equality of man, and during the Qajar period, you do have like several like there are a lot of records of people who had been freed who would join these Sufi tariqats, and that was sort of, I mean, there were so few opportunities for them in freedom as well, right? That became really attractive to some people for asserting their equality. There is another conversation about abolition happening, and that was because of, questions of the constitutional revolution that we're bringing up and the questions of citizenship. But these were not like, we should stop enslaving people because we believe it's bad. They were more like, we should stop enslaving people because it makes us bad citizens. And we would be better citizens if we lived in nuclear families and if there weren't outsiders meddling in our family. That was the rhetoric that was going on. And by the constitutional period, there was a sense amongst some of the sort of intellectuals, some of the people who are writing that it's backwards, that Iran has slavery on the books. And it's what's keeping Iran behind in modernization in comparison to like England, for example. But it wasn't like a benevolent read, whereas I would say like some of the stuff that's going on with the Sufis was a much more benevolent, humanistic read of the situation. But it's not like there's no like abolition movement that's happening, right? Even those conversations, even if they're taking place in the constitutional revolution, it it doesn't it's not finalized until 1929. And there, you can argue that a lot of people were not enslaving people by this time. And you can also argue that slavery was not super widespread in Iran. Like it happened in many different places. And but it really was something that happened in the homes of the elite and the homes of people who were royals or related to royals. In the South, it was more prevalent because of the ability to access enslaved Black people. Sorry, where was I going with this? Oh, it wasn't, but actually what's more damning for me is not that it was super common, but actually what I found in my research is that Iranians who could not enslave people, so like middle class Iranians, really aspired to, even though it was like clearly out of reach. So you have records of families hiring free Black people to sort of cosplay as an enslaved person within their home. And so even though the numbers were low, it's that sort of aspirational attitude towards enslavement that I think persisted and allowed for the racism to persist even after abolition.
I have a follow-up question to that. Were freed slaves allowed to own, have property? Like, were they limited because of their former position as a slave from accessing what other people would consider rights as a citizen?
No, that's a great question. There's no period of legal Jim Crow in Iran. So once they're free, they're given citizenship just like everyone else. They receive their birth certificates just like everyone else. So on that sort of legal framework, they're citizens. But like economic opportunities are sort of closed off to them depending on who's willing to work with them, who trusts them, who doesn't trust them. Even in their birth certificates, you know, for those of you who know Iranian history, you know, unless you were a royal, Iranians pick their own last names in the 1930s. But in the case of many Black Iranians, they were sort of given racist and racist slurs as last names. And just sort of like they would go to the notary to pick up their paperwork. And, you know, these other Iranian families would pick these really laudatory last names like Shayeste, dignified, Iran Dost, loves Iran. And they're given the option of choosing their last name, but for Black Iranians, that choice was sometimes limited or thwarted completely. So legally, yes, but socially and economically, no, absolutely not.
Okay, thank you. Rumi has a question. She's asking a little bit about the confluence of Black and slave happening gradually once Blackness was established in a particular way. I wonder if in that process, the opposite of Black was then understood as white, or if another category was assigned to enslavers. Additionally, how do you see the Aryan myth and general conceptions of whiteness influencing this erased and intentionally ignored history today in Iran and the diaspora?
Yeah, absolutely. In my book, I talk about how you have this diversity of people who are being enslaved in Iran, right? So, and it's very common in documents to see, like I mentioned earlier, Kaniz Siyah, but also Kaniz Sefid, Ghulam Sefid, or the sort of ethnic terms. So like Kaniza Cherkesi, or like the photograph I showed of you where it's just Cherkesi. So Iranians didn't use whiteness as a self-identifying racial term while that was still prevalent. And so it really requires the sort of impossibility of enslaving white people, or people who were coded as white at the time, before Iranians can take that on. But once Blackness really does become equated with slave, and I know I showed you all earlier examples from the mid 19th century, but it really becomes cemented in the late 19th century. That's when you start seeing these like tracks about the Aryan myth and so on and so forth. But it requires that sort of first examples of enslavement to be impossible. And the emphasis on enslaved people becoming Black totally sets up this foil for, okay, well, if enslaved people are Black, then the free people must be white. And that it does feed into that, absolutely. Oh, Persis, I can't hear you.
Mute. Sorry. Hoda is asking a little bit about whether you perceive that unveiling this hidden history will help us confront the pervasive anti-Blackness that exists in people's hearts. And I guess I would add also, is there a way for people in Iran to consider the work that you've done? Are there conversations like this taking place in Iran at all? Or is this really the work of one scholar who's insisting that, hey, it's all here?
I mean, no, I mean, I hope so. I hope that it does something, but I think it has to be more than just my book, right? And that's why I really appreciated the work of the Collective for Black Iranians for making themselves so vulnerable and available to people for, I mean, their work for, 2 to 3 years was very consistent and very strong in bringing these conversations forward, both in English and in Persian. And, the Collective is a transnational organization. So they had people from all over really taking part in that conversation. And Persis, absolutely, this conversation is happening in Iran too now. But it can't just be me. So that's why I'm grateful to the center, to Persis for having me, to others who have hosted me and engaged with my book, and to you all for coming tonight, in hopes that the conversation can build and move forward, and there's so much more work that needs to be done. So I mean, yeah.
We just have a few more minutes, so we don't want to keep Beeta too long because she's on the East Coast and she has younger children. So if you do have any questions, now's a good time to ask. I wonder if you could also, one of the most common ways of erasing slavery in Iran is to compare it to chattel slavery in the US context. And I wonder how you've used the idea of domestic servants, domestic slavery, and the sort of class interests of those who were enslavers. But in some ways, it's also it's beyond the, like when you think about the ethics of enslaving people, it doesn't really matter. I mean, of course, it's horrible to have people beaten and have their children stolen from them. but in some ways those hierarchies are used as foils to like dismiss. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the importance of thinking about slavery in many different contexts and the violence of it, even if it is not displayed in the same way, for example, in some of these photographs.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, the violence of it was not meant to be photographed. Like that's just like the first thing I have to say. And in terms of, I mean, it was the fact that they're photographed in such a pristine, presentable way is part of the violence of it, right? And that's because they were made to be seen as extensions of their enslaver. So the better dressed that they were, the better it reflected on their enslaver. So that the violence is embedded in that way, but because of the way that we've been conditioned to think about enslavement, it's not immediately apparent, right? And so that's why I had this sort of paradox with the photographs, where the photographs are this sort of like piece of technology where people in the 19th century who saw these photographs would have immediately recognized the enslavement that was happening within it. They would have immediately racialized and showed, sort of computed the hierarchies that they're seeing. But these sort of photographs also circulate on social media today and about like, oh, look how nice. They all live together as a family or whatever. I do think the sort of like obsession with US chattel slavery becomes counterproductive. Um, I think it becomes like this sort of oppression Olympics that people want to play. Like, oh well, that one was worse. This one was better. This is whatever. But I mean, in my research, I can only go off of what I found. And if you want me to strictly talk about the violences that I found, I can. I found families that were separated. I found children that were taken from their mothers. I found enslaved peoples whose mouths were sewn together because they talked back to their enslavers. I found people who were beaten. I found people who were killed in these beatings for their punishments. Or I found examples of enslaved people who were afraid of being the messenger of bad news because of the possibility of being killed. So like, if that's what people require me to talk about, if that's what people want to hear in their comparisons to the US, or they think that they won't hear it, do you know what I'm saying? Like, if by invoking the US, you think that like, oh, well, there were no lynchings, there were no whippings, there was no Jim Crow. Okay, but I don't have to use that as the standard of what it looks like, because there's a whole host of something going on that I can ethically say, and you all can look at and say, this was not right. And this was not a better condition of living. So that's my response to this sort of deflective question that is often presented. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to
Thank you.
back
Yeah.
that question.
I think we have the perfect question to end on, which is, do you have any suggestions on how to broach this topic with older Iranians? I'm curious if my ancestors were enslavers and don't know how to get an honest answer out of my older relatives.
Mm, yeah.
Maybe get them to read the book.
Get them, I mean, you can try to get them to read the book, but depending on their age, they may or may not realize what you're asking, and they may or may not think it's bad. And I found that if I were talking to Iranians of a certain generation, not our generation, I assume we're in the same generation, but not our generation, but like maybe our parents or our grandparents' generation, because they don't see it as enslavement, um, they might just answer you honestly, depending on what words you use. So if you say, oh, did our family enslave people? They will probably say absolutely not. Sorry, and I'm making generalizations about your family, but in general, if you ask Iranians, oh, did we have slavery? A certain generation will say absolutely not. There was no slavery in Iran. Cyrus the Great freed all the slaves. But then if you push forward and you say, in Persian, if you say, oh, ولی کنیز و غلام داشتن, or did they have کنیز and غلام? And these terms are hard to translate directly into English. Some people, I mean, the most direct translation is an enslaved girl or enslaved boy, but it can also sort of vaguely mean an errand boy. It can also vaguely mean a servant or just a younger woman or of a lower class, right? So if you want to use those terms, you might be able to get somewhere with the conversation. Good luck. Feel free to email me if you want more resources on that. But I do have a friend who, when I was doing field work in Iran, I was like, oh, I'm going to these cities, and I don't really know anyone in this one city. And she said, oh, you know, my family's super well connected. Please reach out to my cousin. I'm sure they'll be able to help you. Also, they have this like hilarious story where they keep saying I'm a princess. Can you figure it out for me? Like, I don't know what they're talking about. And yeah, her family was super well connected because she was literally a princess. She didn't know, but she was a descendant of the Safavid dynasty, and her own family ended up being a big enslaving family, and she didn't know. And it's because of the sort of the language changes that happen through generations and sort of the meanings of things changing. And so when I describe my research to them, I was fully expecting them to be like, oh yeah, we know this library, like we'll take you to this library. And they were like, oh, let's pull out our own family albums. So that was a shock to me and her, but it just requires a conversation, is I think what my answer to you is. But yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry, there's one more question that I think you can answer quickly. Atiye asks, is there any Persian literary piece which speaks of enslavement directly or indirectly?
Yes, many. I would look at Amir Hossein Wafa's work, and also Amy Motlagh has written on authors and stories that include histories of enslavement within them. So thank you for that question.
Okay. We're going to let you go now, and I want to thank you so much for your wonderful talk and your incredibly diligent and meticulous research. And I also want to put a plug in for this wonderful book, which you can purchase with a 30% discount from Duke University Press. Nick put the link in the chat and the code is there. You can also go to our Instagram and see it there. That the website information is there if you didn't catch it above. I think spending time reading the book and talking about it with your family or even organizing a book group is a great way to maybe start to raise the issues. So I really so appreciate this incredible work that you've done, both on a personal level. I know that you were, operating without any guidance. You had to do, I was trying to imagine you in these archives, thinking about it and what it was like for you both to discover all these things, both the shock and surprise, but also the like, wow, this is a whole narrative that I get to participate in retelling. And so thank you for that incredible work. And Thank you all for coming today, and I look forward to maybe seeing you on Thursday for our tea or at the end of October for our next event. Okay,
Thank you so much.
thank you.
Very much, Beeta. We are grateful for your service. I've been
Okay.
doing community work in the United States the past 35 years, and this book has been the most helpful to me in helping Iranians confront the racial attitudes and the very pervasive anti-Blackness that resides in our hearts. I am very, very grateful to you for your work. Thank you.
Really grateful. Thank you so much. That means a lot to me.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Beeta. Take care. See you soon, I hope.